a notorious crime syndicate boss, 3 motherless infants, a crowded Italian diner in downtown Chicago. When the city's most feared man walked in, absolute silence fell. But no one expected his 1-year-old triplets to point at the plus-size waitress clearing tables and speak their very first word. "Mum." Pamela Hayes adjusted the tight, synthetic fabric of her apron, the strings digging uncomfortably into her waist. Pamela was a fat woman, her heavy, soft frame a physical testament to a year of profound depression and relentless, exhausting survival. She carried her weight with a quiet, enduring dignity, though the world often looked right past her or, worse, stared with undisguised judgment. 14 months ago, her entire universe had been violently ripped away. She had woken up in the sterile, freezing recovery ward of St. Jude's Medical Center to the devastating news that her premature triplets had not survived the emergency delivery. The sheer, unadulterated grief had swallowed her whole, leaving behind a hollow shell of a woman. Food had gradually become her only reliable comfort, an emotional shield against the agonizing emptiness of her quiet apartment. Now, the grueling, back-breaking double shifts at Giovanni's Trattoria in downtown Chicago were her only reason to force herself out of bed each morning. The bell above the heavy glass door of the restaurant chimed, cutting sharply through the clatter of silverware and the low chatter of the evening dinner rush. Almost instantly, the temperature in the bustling dining room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. Conversations died in people's throats. Forks were slowly lowered to plates. Roman Costello had arrived. Roman was the undisputed head of the Costello Syndicate, a ruthless underground empire that controlled the lucrative shipping routes from the Midwest all the way to the eastern seaboard. He was a man carved from cold marble and casual violence, possessing sharp, unforgiving features, a rigid jawline, and eyes the color of a dark, stormy sea. Clad in a bespoke charcoal suit that expertly hid the lethal weapons he carried, he radiated an aura of pure, unchecked authority. His late wife, Victoria, had passed away in a suspicious, fiery car wreck 6 months prior. Her untimely demise had left the feared Mafia Boss as the sole caretaker of 3 beautiful, fiercely demanding 1-year-old triplets, Leo, Arthur, and Mia. Flanked by 4 massive, heavily armed enforcers, Roman pushed a custom-built, triple-wide stroller into the center of the restaurant. The manager, a perpetually sweaty and nervous man named Paul, practically sprinted from behind the hostess stand, bowing his head submissively as he ushered the Costello family to the secluded VIP section in the back corner. Back in the kitchen, panic was spreading like wildfire. The other waitresses, young, thin, and absolutely terrified of the syndicate's brutal reputation, flatly refused to go anywhere near the back booth. Paul burst through the swinging kitchen doors, his face pale, and violently shoved a heavy tray of water glasses into Pamela's hands. "You do it, Penny," Paul hissed, his voice trembling. "None of the other girls will go out there. If you mess this up and upset him, you're fired before you can even take off your apron. Go." Pamela sighed deeply, her aching knees protesting as she pushed her large body through the swinging doors and carried the tray toward the back booth. She wasn't particularly afraid of Roman Costello. When you have already endured the worst pain imaginable and lost your entire world, terrifying men in expensive suits hold very little power over you. As she approached the table, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The triplets were in the middle of a massive collective meltdown. Little Leo was wailing at the top of his lungs, furiously tossing his favorite velvet plush bear onto the hardwood floor. Arthur was screaming, his small face turning a deep, angry crimson, while tiny Mia whimpered loudly, large tears streaming down her chubby cheeks. Roman looked completely exhausted, rubbing his temples in frustration. It was a rare, vulnerable crack in his terrifying facade. His hardened enforcers stood rigidly nearby, shifting uncomfortably, entirely helpless against the wrath of 3 crying infants. Pamela stepped up to the table, her soft, round face automatically breaking into a gentle, knowing smile. She ignored the intimidating glares of the bodyguards and leaned down to retrieve the thrown toy, her large frame moving with a surprising, quiet grace. "Well now," Pamela cooed softly, her voice a rich, melodic hum that had always calmed her own frayed nerves during her darkest nights. "That is an awful lot of noise for such beautiful little ones. What seems to be the matter?" What happened next defied all logic and reason. At the exact sound of her gentle voice, Leo stopped crying instantly. His big, tear-filled hazel eyes snapped open and locked onto Pamela's face. Arthur sniffled loudly, his frantic screaming dying in his throat as he turned his head to stare intently at the waitress. Mia let out a soft, surprised gasp, eagerly reaching her tiny hands out over the edge of the stroller toward Pamela. Roman froze, his hand dropping slowly from his temple. His enforcers instantly tensed, their hands hovering near their concealed holsters. The triplets were notoriously difficult and deeply untrusting. They routinely rejected highly trained nannies, extended family members, and strangers alike. They only ever settled for Roman. Pamela stood there holding the plush bear, suddenly feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of the Mafia Boss's intense stare. She carefully placed the toy on the table. I'll just get your menus," she stammered, suddenly hyper-aware of her worn, stained uniform and her heavy figure under his piercing, analytical gaze. But as she took a hesitant step back, Leo reached out, his tiny fingers grasping desperately at the air. He let out a loud, crystal-clear sound that echoed in the silent corner of the restaurant. "Mum." The entire room seemed to completely stop breathing. Arthur immediately followed suit, pointing a chubby little finger directly at Pamela's chest. "Mum! Mum!" Mia giggled brightly, bouncing up and down in her seat, her small, joyful voice joining the incredible chorus. "Mum! Mum!" Roman Costello stood up slowly, towering over the table. The sheer, overwhelming intensity radiating from him was enough to suffocate everyone in the immediate vicinity. He looked from his children who had never spoken a single word in their short lives, children whose supposed mother had tragically died 6 months ago, to the terrified, overweight waitress trembling before him. "What did you do?" Roman demanded, his voice a low, dangerous gravel that promised absolute destruction. "Nothing!" Pamela gasped, taking another step back, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. "I swear to you, I just picked up the toy. I don't know why they said that. I've never seen them before in my life." Roman's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, scanning every single inch of her face. He saw her genuine, undisguised fear, but as he stared, he also saw something else. He saw the exact same shade of striking hazel in her eyes that stared back at him every single day from his children's faces. He saw the same curve of their noses. A cold, terrifying, and impossible suspicion began to take root deep in his mind. "Donovan!" Roman barked sharply, without ever breaking eye contact with Pamela. His heavily scarred underboss stepped forward instantly from the shadows. "Yes, boss. Get her name. Get everything. I want her entire life laid out on my desk in exactly 1 hour," Roman commanded. He finally turned his gaze back to his children, who were still reaching desperately for the terrified waitress, crying out with yearning for the mother they had never known. The heavy oak doors of Roman Costello's private office slammed shut, sealing the room in a tense, suffocating silence. Roman stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering skyline of Chicago, a glass of amber whiskey gripped tightly in his hand. His mind was a chaotic storm of rage and confusion. He could not stop thinking about the waitress. Pamela Hayes. He could not erase the image of his children, his fiercely guarded, untouchable children, reaching out to a complete stranger and claiming her as their own. Behind him, Donovan cleared his throat, stepping into the dim light of the office. He carried a thick, heavily categorized manila folder. "You have it?" Roman asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Everything, boss," Donovan replied, placing the file squarely on the center of Roman's massive mahogany desk. "And you are not going to like what I found. It took some deep digging, overriding medical encryption. But the timeline, it is undeniable." Roman walked over and flipped the folder open. The first page was a photograph of Pamela. She looked utterly broken, her eyes devoid of light. Roman skimmed the attached documents. Pamela Hayes, 28 years old, no criminal record. She was drowning in massive medical debt left behind by her late mother's extensive cancer treatments. But it was the second page that made Roman's breath catch in his chest. 14 months ago, Pamela had been admitted to St. Jude's Medical Center. She had been heavily pregnant. According to the highly classified, buried records Donovan had unearthed, Pamela had given birth to triplets. The very next page contained 3 death certificates, all signed and authorized by the hospital's chief of obstetrics, Dr. Harrison Mitchell. She was told her children died during an emergency delivery, Donovan explained quietly, watching his boss's face darken with a terrifying, homicidal rage. "But I checked the morgue logs for that month. No infants were processed. None." Roman's grip on the file tightened until his knuckles turned white. He thought back to his late wife, Victoria. Victoria had been notoriously vain, obsessed with her physical appearance, and deeply, passionately resentful of the idea of ruining her perfect figure with a pregnancy. When she had announced she was pregnant 14 months ago, she had immediately insisted on leaving the country. She claimed she needed to stay at an exclusive, secluded holistic retreat in the Swiss Alps for her health and privacy. Roman, deeply entangled in a brutal turf war in Palermo at the time, had stayed behind to secure his family line's assets. Victoria had returned to Chicago 9 months later, stepping off a private jet, looking perfectly slim, presenting Roman with 3 newborn babies. "Victoria never carried those children," Roman whispered, the horrifying realization crashing down upon him like a physical blow. "She bought them." "It gets worse, boss," Donovan said grimly. "I looked into Dr. Mitchell's finances. 2 days after Pamela Hayes delivered her babies, an offshore account linked to Victoria deposited exactly $2 million into Mitchell's private trust. A deadly, silent fury washed over Roman. His entire life with his children, the very foundation of his family, had been built on a foundation of horrific deception and the unimaginable suffering of an innocent woman. Victoria had manipulated a corrupt doctor to steal babies from a desperate, heavily indebted woman who had no family left to protect her. Pamela had spent the last year mourning children who were perfectly healthy, children who were currently sleeping in custom cribs in Roman's mansion. "Prepare the car," Roman ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion. "We are paying a visit to St. Jude's." 20 minutes later, Roman Costello walked into the pristine, brightly lit corridors of the medical center. He did not need to raise his voice to instill absolute terror. He simply walked past the protesting receptionists, entered Dr. Harrison Mitchell's opulent private consultation room, locked the heavy door, and pulled down the blinds. Roman placed a silenced pistol on the polished desk with a heavy thud. Dr. Mitchell, a man whose arrogance was entirely built on wealthy clients and exclusive country club memberships, instantly crumbled. Within 3 minutes, sobbing and begging for his life, the doctor confessed everything. Victoria had approached him, demanding he find a vulnerable, isolated woman. When Pamela came in for her delivery, Mitchell heavily sedated her, stole the infants, falsified the death records, and handed the triplets directly to Victoria's private security detail in the underground parking garage. She was poor, she was drowning in debt, Mitchell wept, trembling violently as Roman stared at him with dead eyes. Victoria said she was doing the children a favor. She gave them a better life. Roman slowly picked up his weapon, tucking it back inside his suit jacket. You have exactly 1 hour to leave this city, Roman said softly, his voice slicing through the air like a razor. If my men ever see your face in Chicago again, I will not be as forgiving. Leaving the weeping doctor behind, Roman rushed out of the hospital. His chest physically ached. He thought of Pamela. He thought of the heavy, exhausted woman in the diner, enduring the mockery of the world and the cruelty of her boss, all while carrying a grief that was entirely manufactured by his own late wife. Drive to the restaurant, Roman commanded his driver, the second he got into the SUV. Now, when Roman's vehicle pulled up to the alleyway behind Giovanni's trattoria, the sky had broken open, unleashing a freezing, torrential downpour. Roman stepped out of the vehicle, ignoring the rain soaking his expensive suit. There, sitting on an overturned, broken milk crate by the dumpsters, was Pamela. She was no longer wearing her apron. Her heavy shoulders shook with violent, heartbreaking sobs, her face buried in her hands. Paul, the manager, had made good on his threat. She had been fired. Roman stopped a few feet away, his heart clenching at the sight of her pure, unadulterated despair. This woman, discarded and humiliated by society, forced into grueling labor to survive her trauma, was the true mother of his children, the woman who had given them life. Roman took a slow step forward, the sound of his expensive leather shoes splashing in the puddles, cutting through the sound of the rain. Pamela gasped, looking up, her tear-streaked face freezing in terror as the towering Mafia Boss stopped directly in front of her. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. Instead, the most feared man in Chicago slowly took off his custom suit jacket and gently draped it over Pamela's soaking wet, shivering shoulders. "You're coming with me," Roman said softly, his voice completely devoid of its usual harsh edge. "It's time to go home to your children." The drive to the Costello estate was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. Pamela sat rigidly in the plush leather seat of the armored SUV, Roman's massive, expensive suit jacket still draped over her trembling shoulders. The sheer absurdity of the situation warred with a terrifying, blossoming spark of hope in her chest. The rain battered the tinted windows, reflecting the neon lights of the Chicago skyline as they drove deep into the exclusive, highly secured northern suburbs. When the massive wrought-iron gates of Roman's compound finally swung open, Pamela gasped. The estate was a sprawling, stone fortress, surrounded by high walls and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Roman led her inside the grand foyer, a space dominated by sweeping marble staircases and crystal chandeliers. It was a world of unimaginable wealth, utterly alien to Pamela's life of cramped apartments and unpaid utility bills. "Take her to the East Wing. Get her dry clothes," Roman instructed an older, stern-looking housekeeper named Maria. He turned his piercing gaze to Pamela. "Change, then come to my study. We have a great deal to discuss." 10 minutes later, dressed in a set of luxurious, oversized silk pajamas that draped softly over her generous curves, Pamela was escorted into a mahogany-paneled room. Roman was standing by the fireplace, the dancing flames casting long, harsh shadows across his chiseled face. He motioned for her to sit in a plush velvet armchair. "I am not a man who dances around the truth." "Pamela," Roman began, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "And the truth I uncovered tonight is horrific." He placed the thick manila folder on the coffee table between them. With methodical, terrifying precision, Roman laid out the entire sickening conspiracy. He explained how his late wife, Victoria, terrified of ruining her socialite figure, had orchestrated a monstrous crime. He detailed Dr. Mitchell's betrayal, the falsified death certificates, and the agonizing realization that the triplets Pamela had mourned for over a year were, in fact, alive and well, sleeping just upstairs. You had gone to Mitchell's clinic for a highly compensated surrogacy program to pay for your mother's cancer treatments, Roman stated, his eyes tracing the soft, devastated lines of her face. Victoria manipulated the entire process. She ensured you were the surrogate using my genetic material and her selected donor eggs. But Donovan's deep dive into the clinic's encrypted files revealed a secondary, far more sinister truth. Victoria never used a donor egg. She used yours. She wanted zero biological connection to the children, only the appearance of an heir to appease my syndicate. You are their biological mother. Pamela could not breathe. The room spun violently. The devastating grief that had defined her entire existence, the crushing weight that had led her to find solace in food and isolation, was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated evil. "My babies," Pamela whispered, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of tears cascaded down her cheeks. They are mine? Truly mine." "They are yours," Roman confirmed softly. Without asking for permission, Pamela stood up. The desperate, primal need to see her children overrode any fear she held for the lethal Mafia Boss standing before her. Roman read the fierce determination in her eyes and silently led her up the grand staircase to the heavily guarded nursery. Inside the dimly lit room, 3 custom-built cribs stood in a row. Pamela approached the first one on trembling legs. Little Leo was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Next to him, Arthur was curled around his plush bear. Finally, Mia, whose tiny hand was resting against the wooden slats. Pamela fell to her knees in the center of the room, her heavy frame shaking with silent, agonizing sobs. She wept for the lost year, for the milestones stolen from her, and for the sheer, overwhelming joy of finding them alive. At the sound of her crying, Leo stirred. He pulled himself up on the bars of his crib, rubbing his hazel eyes. When he saw Pamela on the floor, his face lit up with absolute, undeniable recognition. "Mum," he babbled happily, reaching his arms out through the bars. Pamela scooped him up, pressing his warm, soft cheek against hers, burying her face in his soft curls. Arthur and Mia quickly woke, adding their voices to the chorus, demanding to be held by the woman their infant instincts fundamentally recognized. Standing in the doorway, Roman Costello watched the scene unfold. For years he had been surrounded by artificial women, thin, calculating, and cold. Victoria had been a viper in silk. But as he watched Pamela, a woman whose body bore the physical evidence of her trauma, a woman who possessed a soft, heavy, undeniable warmth, he felt a profound, tectonic shift within his dark soul. She was not a supermodel. She was real, enduring, and fiercely beautiful in her vulnerability. She was the matriarch his fractured family desperately needed. "You will never return to that diner," Roman declared, stepping into the room and gently placing a hand on Pamela's shoulder. "You will never worry about a medical bill, a predatory landlord, or the cruelty of this city again. This is your home now." Pamela looked up at him, clutching Mia and Leo to her generous chest. "I don't belong in a mafia empire, Roman. I am just a waitress." "You are the mother of my heirs," Roman corrected, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "And from this moment forward, you are under my absolute protection." 3 weeks passed. The transformation within the Costello estate was nothing short of miraculous. The cold, silent mansion had been brought to vibrant life by Pamela's presence. She refused to let the staff hide in the shadows, insisting on cooking large, hearty meals in the massive industrial kitchen. She filled the halls with the sounds of the triplets' laughter, Roman found himself leaving his illicit business meetings early just to return home. He became completely captivated by Pamela. He loved the soft, plush curve of her waist when his hand accidentally brushed against her. He loved the way her round cheeks flushed when he caught her singing to the babies. For the first time in his violent life, the fearsome boss of the Costello syndicate knew peace. But peace, in Roman's world, was always an illusion. The threat did not come from a rival gang, but from within his own family. Matteo Costello, Roman's deeply ambitious and ruthless cousin, had grown disgusted by Roman's sudden domestic softening. Matteo had always coveted the throne of the syndicate. When he discovered the truth, that Victoria had faked her pregnancy, and that the new woman living in the mansion was a lowly, overweight civilian, he saw his golden opportunity. Matteo intended to wipe out the triplets, claiming they were illegitimate, and assassinate Roman to seize complete control. It happened on a Tuesday night. Roman was delayed at the shipping docks, leaving the estate temporarily under the watch of his day-shift security. Pamela was in the nursery, humming softly as she rocked Mia to sleep. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the mansion was shattered by the harsh, deafening sound of automatic gunfire downstairs. The estate's alarm system began shrieking, casting the hallways in a flashing, panicked red strobe light. Donovan burst into the nursery, his suit jacket torn and his face grim. "Matteo's men have breached the perimeter. They bypassed the outer gates. We are outnumbered, Pamela. You have to hide the children, now." Adrenaline, pure and maternal, flooded Pamela's system. She didn't freeze. She didn't panic. She grabbed the emergency reinforced duffel bag Roman had insisted she keep packed, loaded the 3 terrified, crying toddlers inside, and zipped it up just enough for them to breathe. "The panic room is in the basement," Donovan yelled over the sound of approaching boots on the marble stairs. "I will hold them off." "No," Pamela said firmly, her voice devoid of its usual softness. "They know about the panic room. Roman told me Matteo designed the security grids. We go to the roof. The maintenance access." Pamela hauled the heavy bag over her shoulder. Her large frame, which she had so often despised, now provided the immense physical strength she needed to carry her 3 children simultaneously. She moved with surprising agility, bursting through the service corridors just as Matteo's heavily armed enforcers kicked open the nursery doors behind them. They reached the heavy steel door leading to the roof access. Pamela shoved the door open, pushing the children out into the cool night air. But as she turned to follow, a massive enforcer stepped out from the stairwell, raising his weapon directly at Donovan. Without a single second of hesitation, Pamela threw her entire body weight forward. She slammed her heavy shoulder directly into the enforcer's chest like a battering ram. The sheer force of the impact sent the man tumbling backward, down the steep, concrete stairs with a sickening crunch. Suddenly, a cold, metallic click echoed behind her. Pamela spun around to find Matteo Costello standing there, a cruel, triumphant smirk twisting his aristocratic face. His weapon was pointed directly at her chest. "Look at you," Matteo sneered, looking her up and down with absolute disgust. Roman's new prize, a fat, pathetic waitress pretending to be a queen. Victoria was a monster, but at least she looked the part. "You? You are a disgrace to the Costello name. Move aside, Pamela. Let me end those fake airs, and I might let you run away." Pamela did not flinch. She squared her broad shoulders, completely blocking the doorway to the roof, her eyes burning with the fierce, protective fury of a mother who had already lost her children once. "You will have to go through me, Matteo," Pamela snarled, her voice echoing with a terrifying power she didn't know she possessed. "And I promise you, I will drag you to hell with me." Matteo's smirk faded. He raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Matteo!" The roar was not human. It was the sound of an apex predator who had just found its prey threatening its mate. Roman Costello stood at the end of the hallway, flanked by a dozen of his most lethal men. He was drenched in rain and fury, his eyes devoid of any humanity. Matteo barely had time to turn his head before Roman raised his own weapon and fired a single, deafening shot. Matteo's weapon clattered to the floor as he collapsed, eliminated instantly by the true boss of the syndicate. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Roman dropped his weapon, ignoring his men who were sweeping the floor, and sprinted toward Pamela. He crashed into her, wrapping his massive arms around her soft, shaking body, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her with a desperate, terrifying strength, inhaling her scent. "I have you," Roman choked out, his cold, hardened exterior completely shattered. "I have you. You are safe." Pamela wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, burying her face against his chest as the adrenaline finally left her system, replaced by a profound, unshakable relief. The next morning, the sun rose over a syndicate that had been brutally and efficiently purged of all traitors. Roman had solidified his empire, but more importantly, he had solidified his family. Sitting in the massive sunlit dining room, Pamela fed Arthur a spoonful of oatmeal, her laughter ringing out as Mia threw a piece of toast at Roman's head. Roman, the most feared man in the Midwest, simply caught the toast, his eyes locked on Pamela. He admired the soft roll of her stomach against the table, the radiant, healthy flush of her cheeks, and the absolute confidence she now carried herself with. She was no longer the broken, discarded waitress in the heavy apron. She was Pamela Costello. She was the matriarch of the empire, the fierce protector of the heirs, and the only woman who held the dark, dangerous heart of Roman Costello entirely in her soft, capable hands. And as little Leo pointed his sticky finger at her, calling out a joyful "Mum!" Roman knew his empire was finally complete. Did Pamela's fierce maternal instincts and undeniable courage take your breath away? Her incredible journey from a heartbroken waitress to a powerful mafia matriarch proves that true strength comes in every shape and size, and a mother's love can conquer the darkest of empires. If you were captivated by this intense tale of betrayal, redemption, and unconventional romance, hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories.